what we're doing right now is we're walking through just a few weeks and zeroing in on the Gospel of Luke, where there are the passages related to Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And so last week we talked a lot about that Resurrection Sunday. And today we're going to take a step further. And there are some Bibles in the seat backs of most of the chairs. I think we had to pull some extra chairs out earlier. But if you want to grab one, go to Luke chapter 24. And as you're turning there and finding your place, we will kind of get started here and walk through that passage together. On the day of the resurrection, there were two particular disciples, and they were walking from Jerusalem, a town, to Emmaus. And this is about a 7-mile walk for these two men away from the city where everything has fallen apart. Now you got to realize that for us, we already know the ending of the story. If you were here last week, we celebrated how this whole thing worked out. But if you were a person who was a disciple in the days right after Jesus had resurrected, the last thing that you saw was your friend being brutally killed, murdered, executed, as if he was just a common criminal. And so these two men are walking along the road to this town, Emmaus. And the thing that's really fascinating, I think, is an interesting context to think about. Emmaus is a disputed location. Scholars have a very difficult time figuring out where it actually is on a map. We have very little historical evidence that that town even existed. It sounds like when we say that they were on a road to Emmaus, it's like they were on a road to Bon Aqua, Tennessee, which is a town. I know because I've been there, but you haven't heard of it, have you? Because it's completely in the middle of nowhere, right? You imagine it's one of those kinds of places, one stoplight town that if you blink, you're going to miss it. That's Emmaus. Now, the reason why I find that so fascinating is that when the text shows us that they were walking toward a place called Emmaus, a place that most people didn't even know existed, that to me is fascinating. It's as if to say that these two men were walking toward uncertainty, toward a lack of definition, toward a lack of clarity. And as they are walking along the road, confused from this experience, disillusioned because their friend has been killed, a stranger meets them and begins walking next to them on the road. Someone that they didn't recognize. In fact, in verse 16, Luke 24, verse 16, it says this, it says, "But they were kept from recognizing him." Now, the Greek here is a divine passive, which basically means that this is something that is said where whoever did this was outside of them. It wasn't them. They were kept from seeing him. You hear that? They were kept. If they were kept, then that means somebody kept them from being able to see who they were walking with. This indicates that God is the agent of the action. It's not an accident of just grief or exhaustion that they don't recognize him. God is actively preventing them from recognizing the person who is walking with them. And the encounter on the road is designed to happen before the reveal. Jesus wants to walk with them. He wants to hear their story. He wants to enter into their confusion and into their disillusionment before they know who he is. And he asks questions before he gives answers. Now, I am a person who was raised in the Bible Belt South. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, miles from the Southern Baptist Convention headquarters. I grew up in a fundamentalist environment. Fundamentalism basically means we were better than you and we had a lot of rules. Okay, that's what it means. Now, I'm not in that anymore. I've come out of that on the other side, relatively unscathed. But here's what I know. I know that some of the relationships that I had with people were damaged when all I did was come to them with answers. when they were hurt, confused, and searching for answers, the last thing they wanted was for me to come alongside and tell them that I had all of them. What they wanted was for someone to ask questions. What they wanted was for someone to sit in the pain with them. And this is what Jesus does. He comes and he enters into their pain before he offers any answers. It says, we had hoped. The stranger asks what they were talking about, and they stop walking and they tell him everything. It says, we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's the third day since all this took place. Now, some of us in our imagination, we think of this event as being very rapid, right? Jesus dies, he's buried, 3 days later he rises, and then everybody finds out about him. But it's been 3 more days, right? As far as they know, they haven't heard anything to say that Jesus is alive, and he's walking with them and saying, it's been 3 days. I mean, if it had been quicker, maybe they would believe, and maybe they might even recognize that he was there with them. We had hoped. And the other thing, right, is they're speaking in past tense. You get that? We had hoped. They gave up hope. The hope was already past. This is the language of crushed expectations. Not cynicism, not atheism. These are people who believed completely. They went all in, and then they watched it fall apart. And so that sentence, we had hoped, is the disillusioned disciples' exact wording for how they would articulate that moment. The stranger, as he's walking with them, who we now know as Jesus, he opens up Moses and the prophets. He opens up their own teachings for them. And he shows them how the whole story has been moving toward this moment. In verse 27, he reads, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Now, what I know is that the scriptures are not a rule book, no matter how much we try to turn it into that. They aren't a secret decoder ring for predicting the future. They are a story. The 66 books of the Bible, 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 books in the New Testament, form a single cohesive meta-narrative, meaning a story that explains all things. And all of the little stories in between, all of the little moments along the way are just parts of the bigger story. It's as if to say that there is an upper story and a lower story throughout our lives. The upper story is this grand narrative. It's the big picture story that brings explanation and meaning and answers to the lower story, which is your lived experience. Every one of us is experiencing the lower story. We've got our little piece of this. But without God's greater story, we struggle to find meaning. We struggle to find purpose. We struggle to find hope in the midst of all of the chaos that is in this world. A long, honest, and sometimes very confusing story about a God who keeps showing up over and over again, and about a humanity that keeps finding ways to mess up the whole thing, and yet God continues to pursue them over and over and over again. And he shows up in the places that people least expect, with people that nobody would have chosen. I mean, I read the story of Jesus and his ministry, and I look at the 12 people that he chose to be on his team. You see, we're a church plant, right? A church plant means, like, in the same way that you plant a tree, you plant a church, right? You feed it and water it and give it everything that it needs to grow. And when you first start out, you start out by saying, who are going to be the people that are going to be a part of this team to help us dream up this church and, right, charge hell with water pistols, let's go. And you feel like you're building a plane while you're flying in it, and it's craziness the whole time. But when you start, you meet people and you go, wow, you're gifted, you're talented, you've got all this. And then what happens is 9 times out of 10, in my experience, they just move on, right? And I go, well, I wanted that. I wanted that person to be a part of our team. Why don't they see it? Look at what Jesus did. He went and got himself a tax collector. He found a zealot, which is basically a person that's trying to overthrow the government, right? He finds a guy that's going to try to kill him one day, right? I mean, he just goes and finds the biggest ragtag bunch of guys, and they are the worst people to have on his launch team to help him start this church. They're the worst. And yet he chooses them anyway. And this is the character of God. That when you feel like you are the least qualified, you feel like you're the least gifted, you look back on your past and you see things that you are completely ashamed of, and you think, I can't be a part of what God is doing. I'll tell you right now, when I open up the scriptures, I look and I see that God seems to be really good at using messed up people to accomplish his purposes. And this is where I think this stranger that shows up and baffles these men does something remarkable, because he becomes the culmination of a story of a king who redeems people through suffering and not domination. In fact, repeatedly, he keeps telling his disciples, hey, you know, the rulers and the authorities out there, they lord their authority over people, but not so with you. Even when he goes to the cross, this is his coronation, right? He gets his crown, right? Just like a king would get his crown, but his crown is a crown of thorns. He gets a throne, but his throne is a death instrument. This is the scene where you see Jesus going to the cross. It's not, I think 2,000 years doesn't help us. 2,000 years of history between us and that event. In our modern consciousness, we just don't understand what's even going on. But if you were a first century Jew living in Palestine, watching this man being lifted up onto a cross and having a crown of thorns put on his head, you would be thinking about all of the movie quotes of the Old Testament going through your head, all of the things that had been said about this coming Messiah, all of the things that had been said about this king. And you would be asking yourself, how could this possibly be true? Because throughout the Old Testament, they were told that there was a coming lion, the Lion of Judah. They were told about this lion and about how he was going to come and he was going to wage war against all of their enemies. He was going to assume the throne. And when he assumed the throne, that every knee would bow and every tongue would confess that this person is Lord. And Lord is not just God. Lord is a political term. A lord was a governmental ruler. So for people to declare him as Lord is to declare him as king. But yet here they are, and they're watching him go to his cross. And I imagine if you were one of them, you would be thinking, this isn't what I had in mind. This isn't what this whole thing is supposed to be. Where's his real throne? Where's the real crown? And why is Caesar still sitting on his throne? Why? Why is my friend, who I thought was going to be lifted and elevated to power, being lifted and elevated to his death? Why am I watching as nails are going through his wrists and into his ankles? Why am I watching as he's struggling to breathe? And then for him to say, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is not a cry of desperation. You know what he's doing there? He's quoting the Psalms. And if you had heard him, your mind would immediately go back to the movie quotes of the Old Testament, and you would remember that moment, the psalm that began with Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And you would remember this story in this psalm that teaches so beautifully and powerfully how even when we are in our moment of greatest desperation and hurt, when the world feels like it's on fire, that there is hope. Jesus is calling people to hope. And then through blood-soaked eyes to say the most unfathomable words, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Even as he's dying, he's forgiving. You see, this is what theologians call cruciform, meaning that you and I, as a response to the cross, we live a life that is shaped by it. It is cruciform, cross-formed. We live lives that are shaped by the cross, which means no more dominance, no more vengeance, no more power trips. In fact, the calling, and I know this can sound crazy, and as a church plant, you want to know what experts tell you to do? They tell you that when you're first starting out, to just keep it really light, okay? When you're first starting out, just avoid the heavy topics, okay? But at some point, you also have to say the truth, right? And here's the truth. And the truth that I think a lot of us, depending on our backgrounds and whatever we've heard and whatever influencers we're following, we oftentimes miss this. The idea of following King Jesus means taking up your cross. That's what Paul the Apostle said. But taking up your cross means living a life marked by that kind of a sacrifice. So this doesn't mean take up your cross. No more cussing and drinking and smoking. No. Now, maybe you need to give those things up. It's just so much bigger than that. You see, in my tradition that I grew up in, and I don't have any resentment at all, but I do see the flaws because I've seen how it's hurt other people. And in my tradition, what we did was we turned Christianity into what people call moralism. Moralism is essentially, we've created a list of do's and don'ts to show who are the insiders and who are the outsiders, right? And if you can follow the do's and don'ts, then you become an insider. People look at you and say, look, that's what a Christian is supposed to be. But if you don't follow the do's and don'ts, then you become an outsider. And what that does is, I call this box Christianity. We've created a box. And we know who fits in the box and who doesn't. But the way that Jesus operates is totally different than this. I call it bullseye Christianity. He puts a target in front of us, and he's more concerned with whether or not we're headed towards the bullseye than away from it. He's more concerned about that. And so here's the best illustration that I can think of. My daughter, Elia, is 4 years old. Cute. She's got the problem with her R's, right? And she's getting better at that. And I'm very upset because I don't want her to lose that. That's so cute, right? She's at that age, right? And 3 years ago, she started doing something, and she took her first steps. And it was awesome, right? And any parent that's ever been there when your child takes their first steps, it is a magical experience, right? And I just want you to imagine for a moment, okay? Here I am with my daughter, and my daughter's right here, and what do you do, right? You give your daughter give her some space, and then you pull away so that she'll try to walk, right? And you watch her, and what does she do? She gets up on her legs, she kind of does this wobble, right? And then falls. And what do? Do you say, disgusting, I can't believe you just fell down. You're a failure, kid. No, you go, oh, good job, you took a step, right? And then you pick them back up and you try again. And then you pick them back up and you try again. And each time that they take another step, and each time that they take 2 steps and now 3 steps, you're celebrating until eventually they're walking across the room and you're throwing a party. Now, this is the problem. In my tradition, because we were marked by moralism, whenever somebody fell, we scolded them. In fact, we oftentimes humiliated people. We created some very traumatizing experiences for people. We thought we were doing the right thing. So again, this is where I say I'm not resentful. I think we were trying to do the right thing. We were trying to hold people accountable. But in doing that, we were causing people to become traumatized when all they were trying to do was take the next step. They were trying to figure out how to take their steps. What if, as followers of Jesus, and I just have this vision of a church family that's just so different than the moralistic framework that we've kind of been handed. What if we operated differently and instead we were known more for celebrating people getting up to take another step than condemning people for when they fall? Wouldn't that be beautiful, to be known as that kind of a church? And we just need more of that. We need more of that in our culture, and we just don't have enough. Because tragically, the tradition that I grew up in still has a lot of influence, right? And I have really good friends who are a part of that, and I love them, but I think we're just on different pages in this way. And the reason why is because I think when I look at what Jesus does, he just has a remarkable sense of never really condemning people when they're trying to get up and take the next step. You notice who he saves all his words for, right? It's always the people that have all the power, right? It's always the people that actually were more like the people in my tradition, because we had it all together and everybody else is going to hell, right? That was our mentality. I think Jesus would have strong words for us. So here they are, and they arrive at Emmaus, and they invite this stranger to stay. They still don't know who he is. They still don't know. And so he sits at their table. And in verses 30 and 31, it says, when he was at the table with them, he took the bread, he gave thanks, he broke it, he began to give it to them. And then their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And then he disappeared from their sight. Okay. This word, breaking bread, okay? Breaking of bread, klasis tu artu in Greek. It's the exact same phrase that's used in Acts 2:42 for the earliest Christian practice of communion. It's also the same phrase that he used days earlier when he had the Last Supper with his disciples and he broke bread for them and he invited them to have what we now call communion today. This is not accidental. Luke is establishing something, that the primary place where the risen Jesus becomes recognizable is at the table. Every time that the community gathers to break bread, it is an Emmaus moment. Acts 2:42, the verse is, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, and to the breaking of bread and to prayer. He is made known by the breaking of the bread. Now, then, the next thing is, this is awesome in this scene. In verse 32, they asked each other, were our hearts not burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures for us? Now, what that means is that their hearts were set ablaze, to be on fire. But notice the tense. They say this after the recognition. Right? You notice that? It's after they've recognized him that now they're remembering back and saying something was kindling in us. Something was coming up in us. And they're looking back at the road and the burning was happening before they even knew who was walking with them. The Spirit of God was already at work before the awareness of who they were walking with had even arrived. The presence that now has a name was present, nameless, with them on the road. The burning in them of the Holy Spirit was real before the recognition even happened. You see that? That's some gold right there. Take that with you. Because what that means is that God can walk with you and stir something in you before you even know that it's God. You don't have to know that. This is also why I'm very comfortable with not knowing. It's one of the things that I try to tell people, because people will ask me a lot of questions because I've received biblical training and, I've all this stuff, right? And I love to talk about the Bible and everything. But one of the things that I really love is all the gray areas. They're so juicy to me. They're so fun to me. I read the Bible and I see these crazy things, and in my tradition, again, not to harp on it, but in my tradition, we squashed that stuff. Asking questions wasn't really allowed. We were better at the answers than the questions, right? But we should be really good at the questions. There should be no question that should threaten us. We should be able to be in a gathering like this and have a conversation, and somebody should ask a question that for those of us that have been brought up in the church, immediately everything in us goes, no, I know the answer, that's wrong, right? And we should go, no, I'm gonna resist that because the person's asking the question. And the practice of asking questions is much more powerful than the practice of just not asking questions because we think we've got it all figured out. Growing people change. And if you want to grow, you can't do that by thinking you've got it all figured out. You ever think about that? You can't grow if you think you've got it all figured out. So we should be really good at asking questions. Verse 35, then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. So now they're telling people, right? Jesus didn't show up at the end of the road. You notice that? He showed up at the beginning of the road. He didn't wait for them to turn around. He just came right up beside them. He went to them. And so if you are right now, when you're thinking about that bullseye and you're trying to walk towards the target, but I know there are times when we're walking away from it, aren't there? There are times when we're not walking towards the target. There's times when we're walking away. Now, in AA, which I think Alcoholics Anonymous is just such an incredible ministry. It receives no funding. It has no central leadership. It just spreads because it works, right? But in AA, they have a policy. If you show up at AA and you have, you've fallen off, right? You've moved away from the target and you show up, you want to know what people do? You want to know what they do? When you show up, they say, I'm so glad you're here. Yeah. And that's what we need to be. We need to be the kind of a community that when somebody walks away, then when they return, we're so happy to see them. Not, why did you leave? Right? Not, how dare you do that? No. It's, I'm so glad you're here. That we are, and that, I'll just say this because I think people will say like, well, when's the limit? When's the limit? I mean, at what point do we look at a person and go, look, it's too many times, okay? You keep screwing everybody over. You keep being really mean to people. You keep doing whatever. You keep abandoning people. You keep walking away. Okay, now you're not welcome anymore. Well, Jesus was asked that 70 times. You want to know what that actually is? It was a phrase, a way to structure a sentence. It's the same thing that he did when Mary and Martha had him over at their house, and Martha was running around and everything, and Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet, which, by the way, was not just that she was sitting down. That is space that's only reserved for disciples, okay, and people in training for apostleship, okay? Now that's, whatever you think about early apostles, there's something very theologically loaded about the idea that Jesus would allow a woman to sit at his feet and train to become a teaching apostle. Okay, so they're sitting here and they're doing this, right? And then what happens? He turns and he looks over at Martha because she's complaining, right? She's so upset. And he looks over at her because she's trying to get everything together and she's trying to host. She's trying to be a good host, right? Being hospitable. And he looks at her and he says, Martha, Martha. And we read it this way, Martha, Martha, right? You're so concerned about all the unimportant things, but she's figured out the one important thing. What he does here is he repeats the same word multiple times. Now that's what we read. But what we know is that Greek and Hebrew didn't have bold, they didn't have italics, they didn't have underlined. Okay? I know because I've spent a lot of time and a lot of money studying it, right? There is nothing like that. When you want to emphasize something, you repeat the word multiple times. So the likelihood is, and what most scholars believe, is not that Jesus said Martha twice, but that the writer wrote it twice to show us that he was actually shouting, that he was stopping and going, Martha, because she's running around. She's not paying attention. She's upset. She's only thinking about herself in that moment. And in the same way, it's Jesus looks after he's being asked, how many times do you forgive a person? And he says 70 times 7. What it is 7 and then 7 and hey, 70. And it just keeps going. This wasn't an actual number. It's him saying, and here's the thing, because 7 is the number of completion in the scriptures, right? It always represents that something is complete. For him to say that forgiveness has no end, then that means that the only way for forgiveness to be forgiveness is for it to never end. Think about that. No such thing as actual forgiveness if we get to a point where we're not willing to extend it. This is why Jesus says that if you cannot forgive each other, then my Father will not forgive you. And so maybe you've walked out. Maybe you've walked away. Maybe right now you're in a season of life where you've been walking away. You haven't walked outside the reach of risen Jesus. He is already on the road with you, whether you see him or not, whether you recognize him or not. He has been there. And if you're feeling your heart on fire, then it means that the Holy Spirit is doing something in you now before you even ever had anyone point out what it was. And he's been trying to get a word in for a while. He's been trying to talk to you. So I want to do this. I want us to talk about this, okay? I want us to talk about this right here, where we're at. What direction are you in? Where are you at? Okay, so we're going to talk about this at our tables. I'm going to put a question on the screen, and we'll give you 5 minutes. We've got 2 questions. One is, which direction are you walking right now? Toward something, could be Jesus, or if you're like, I'm not ready to be vulnerable, that's okay. Okay, you can talk about anything, okay? Are you walking towards something, away from something, or somewhere in between? Then if you want to go a step deeper, the 2 disciples didn't recognize Jesus while he was walking with them, but they said later that their hearts were burning. Has there been a moment in your life where you sensed something true or alive, but couldn't quite name it at the time? And what was that like? All right. So you got 5 minutes at your tables. Talk about that together.